What happens when a liberal professor tries to publicly humiliate a student she doesn't like, only to realize she just challenged a genius? And not just any genius, a certified 170 IQ prodigy, Barron Trump. Trust me, by the end of the story your jaw will be on the floor. Let me tell you exactly what happened, but first let me know in the comments where you're watching from. In one of America's most prestigious universities, Dr. Linda Markham's advanced calculus class was known for two things: her brilliant mathematical mind and her increasingly obvious political agenda. As students filed into the lecture hall that morning, there was already a tension in the air. The whiteboard wasn't filled with the usual complex equations, but instead displayed a simple message. Today's topic: redefining academic priorities. In the back of the room sat a tall, quiet young man in a perfectly pressed, black suit. Few of his classmates knew him personally. He preferred to keep to himself. But everyone knew who he was: Barron Trump. What they didn't know was that behind his reserved demeanor lay a mathematical mind that would soon shock everyone in that room. Dr. Markham began her lecture, but something was different. Her usual confident stride seemed almost aggressive as she paced before the class. Mathematics, she declared, while important, must make room for more pressing social discussions. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. As she continued outlining her new, balanced curriculum, Barron's hand slowly rose into the air. The professor's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't expected any challenges to her authority today. Dr. Markham's lecture quickly evolved from a discussion of curriculum changes into something more revealing. In today's world, she continued, her voice carrying a hint of condescension, we need to focus less on abstract theories and more on real-world applications of social justice. The silence in the room grew heavier as she pulled up a PowerPoint slide. Instead of the promised calculus materials, it showed statistics about gender representation in STEM fields. Some of you, she said, her gaze drifting meaningfully towards certain students, might need to accept that your privileged position in this class doesn't necessarily reflect merit. Barron's hand remained raised, steady and patient. Other students began glancing back at him, then at each other. A few nodded slightly, seemingly grateful that someone was willing to speak up. But before acknowledging him, Dr. Markham continued, her voice growing more pointed. For instance, she said, clicking to the next slide, family connections and wealth can create artificial advantages in education. The implication wasn't subtle. A few students turned to gauge Barron's reaction, but his expression remained composed, his hand still raised. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Markham couldn't ignore him any longer. Yes, Mr. Trump, she said, her tone carrying a mixture of irritation and amusement. Do you have something to contribute to our discussion about privilege in education? The room fell completely silent. Everyone knew about Barron's perfect test scores and quiet dedication to his studies. They'd seen him helping struggling classmates after hours in the library. But now, as he slowly lowered his hand and began to speak, nobody could have predicted what was about to unfold in that classroom. Barron's voice was measured and respectful as he spoke. Dr. Markham, I believe calculus is fundamental to understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us chose this advanced class specifically to deepen our mathematical knowledge. He paused briefly. Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum potentially disadvantage all students, regardless of their background? Several students nodded in agreement, but Dr. Markham's expression hardened. Mr. Trump, she said, emphasizing his last name, perhaps you could benefit most from understanding how privilege shapes our educational system. After all, not everyone had private tutors and elite prep schools. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of becoming defensive, Barron smiled gently. You're right about one thing, Professor. I have been fortunate in my education. That's precisely why I believe we have a responsibility to maintain high academic standards, so everyone can reach their full potential. The professor's face flushed. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. And you think you know better than your professor about maintaining academic standards? Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Tell me, what makes you such an expert on mathematical education? I'm not claiming to be an expert, Barron replied calmly. I'm just a student who loves mathematics and believes in its power to transcend political divisions. He gestured toward the equation-free whiteboard. "Instead of debating privilege, couldn't we spend this time exploring the beautiful complexities of calculus?" The class held its breath. Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed dangerously. She walked slowly to the whiteboard, marker in hand. "Very well, Mr. Trump. Since you're so passionate about mathematics, let's put that passion to the test." She began writing on the board, her hand moving quickly, crafting something that made several students gasp. As the equation took shape, even the most confident students in the room felt their stomachs sink. This wasn't just any calculus problem. It was the kind of complex integration that even graduate students would struggle with. But what Dr. Markham didn't realize was that she had just opened a door that would change everything. The equation Dr. Markham wrote sprawled across the board. A multivariable calculus problem involving complex integration and series expansion. "Since you're so concerned about maintaining standards," she said with a smirk, "why don't you show us how it's done? Unless, of course, you'd prefer to discuss your privileged background instead." The challenge hung in the air. Several students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing this as a clear attempt at public humiliation. One student even muttered, "That's graduate-level stuff." But Barron's expression remained unchanged, his composure unwavering. "Of course," he said quietly, standing up, "I'd be happy to try." As he walked toward the front of the room, Dr. Markham's smirk widened. She'd chosen this problem specifically because it required techniques she hadn't taught yet, techniques that went far beyond the scope of their current coursework. But something in Barron's calm demeanor made her smile falter slightly. He took the marker she offered, studying the equation with genuine interest rather than the fear she'd expected. A few students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. "Before I begin," Barron said, turning to face the class, "I notice this problem has multiple possible approaches. Would you prefer I use the standard method, or would you be interested in seeing a more efficient solution I learned while studying Leibniz's original papers?" Dr. Markham's expression froze. The casual reference to Leibniz's work caught her off guard. "You've read Leibniz's original papers?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Yes," Barron replied simply. "In German. The translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology." He turned back to the board, marker poised. "But perhaps we should let the mathematics speak for itself." The silence in the room deepened. Dr. Markham's challenge had just taken an unexpected turn, and as Barron began writing his first line of solution, no one, not even the professor, could predict what was about to unfold on that whiteboard. Students watched in stunned silence as Barron's hand moved across the whiteboard with practiced precision. Each step was clear, deliberate, and surprisingly elegant. But what truly caught everyone's attention wasn't just his solving of the problem, it was his running commentary. "This first step," he explained calmly, "uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. His marker continued moving. "It simplifies what appears complex into something more approachable." Dr. Markham's confident expression began to waver as she followed his work. Between steps, Barron would pause briefly, ensuring the entire class could follow his logic. It wasn't just about solving the problem, he was teaching it. Several students had pulled out their phones recording his explanation. Even those who usually struggled with calculus found themselves understanding his approach. "Now," he said, reaching a crucial point in the solution, "we have two paths forward." He turned to Dr. Markham. "The traditional method would take another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using Leibniz's original insights. Which would you prefer to see, Professor?" Dr. Markham stood frozen, her earlier smugness completely evaporated. The question wasn't just about mathematical preference. It was a gentle reminder of the depth of knowledge she had tried to dismiss. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. A hand shot up from the middle of the class. Could we see both?" asked Sarah Chen, one of the quieter students. "This is actually helping me understand the chapter we covered last week better." Barron smiled warmly at Sarah, then looked questioningly at Dr. Markham. The professor's response would reveal far more than just her mathematical preference. It would show whether she could recognize when a teaching moment transcended her personal biases. Just as Dr. Markham was about to respond, The classroom door burst open. Dean Richardson, a known ally of Dr. Markham's political activism, strode in. "Linda," he announced, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the new curriculum changes." The timing couldn't have been worse for Dr. Markham. Or better, as she thought. "We'll have to continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. But before she could step away, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made even the dean pause. Walking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity. The class erupted in murmurs. The dean's face reddened. "Young man, are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir," Barron interrupted politely but firmly. "I'm stating a fact. Dr. Markham issued a public challenge to prove a point about privilege and merit. I accepted. The only question is, will she honor her own challenge?" The tension in the room was electric. Several students had pulled out their phones, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Dr. Markham looked trapped between her ally and her own actions, while the dean seemed unsure whether to assert his authority or back down. Then Barron did something unexpected. He handed the marker back to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said with a slight smile, "you'd prefer to show us your solution first. After all, as you mentioned earlier, family connections shouldn't matter. Only knowledge should. And surely as our professor, you can solve this problem you've presented." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Markham stared at the marker in her hand, suddenly realizing she'd walked into a trap of her own making. The dean's presence no longer felt like a rescue. It was another witness to what was about to unfold. The atmosphere in the classroom was charged with tension as Dr. Markham gripped the marker, her knuckles turning white. The dean shifted uncomfortably, sensing this was no longer a simple classroom dispute. Students held their breath, phones still recording, knowing they were watching a defining moment unfold. Dr. Markham started, then stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the complex equation she'd written. The same equation she'd chosen specifically to humiliate a student was now a sword hanging over her own head. "Perhaps," Barron offered graciously, "we could solve it together. Sometimes collaboration leads to better understanding." His tone held no mockery, no triumph, only a genuine offer to transform this moment of conflict into something constructive. But Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't let her accept the olive branch. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, throwing the marker down. "This entire display is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The dean, sensing disaster, tried to intervene. "Let's all take a step back." "No," Barron said firmly, picking up the marker. "Let's take a step forward." He turned to the board and, in a display of mathematical virtuosity that left the room speechless, completed both solutions, the traditional method and Leibniz's approach, in under 5 minutes. As he wrote the final line, the class erupted in spontaneous applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his amazement. But what happened next would reshape the entire dynamic of not just this class, but the entire department. Dr. Markham's face had gone from red to pale, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling before her eyes. But Barron wasn't finished, and his next words would prove that true leadership isn't about winning arguments, but about building bridges. Barron turned away from the board, facing both Dr. Markham and the dean. "The beauty of mathematics," he said, "is that it doesn't care about our politics, our backgrounds, or our biases. It only cares about truth." He gestured to his solutions. "These equations tell us something important, not just about calculus, but about learning itself. When we let our preconceptions cloud our judgment, we miss opportunities to grow." The dean cleared his throat. "Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that—" "That what?" A voice rang out from the back of the classroom. It was Michael Chen, a scholarship student who rarely spoke up. "That we should learn less math because of someone's political agenda." Other students began standing up. "I came here to learn calculus," another called out, "not to be lectured about my supposed privileges." Dr. Markham's carefully constructed classroom control was unraveling, But instead of letting her face further humiliation, Barron did something remarkable. "Professor," he said, loud enough to quiet the growing dissent, "your mathematical knowledge is extensive. I've learned a lot from your technical lectures. Perhaps we could focus on that? I'd be happy to assist other students after class, combining your theoretical expertise with practical problem solving." The offer hung in the air, a chance for Dr. Markham to save face while actually improving the class. The dean watched intently, realizing this moment could either explode into a PR nightmare or transform into something surprisingly positive. Dr. Markham looked at Barron, then at her students. Really looked at them, perhaps for the first time. What she saw in their faces would force her to make a decision that would change everything. Dr. Markham's voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. She started, then straightened her shoulders. "I've made a terrible mistake." The admission seemed to cost her, but something had shifted in her demeanor. "For years I've been so focused on fighting perceived privilege that I became exactly what I claim to oppose. Someone who judges based on preconceptions rather than merit." She looked at Barron. "You didn't just solve that equation. You taught me something about true leadership." The dean stepped forward, sensing an opportunity. Perhaps this could be a model for other departments. But before he could spin this into an administrative win, chaos erupted outside the classroom. A crowd had gathered in the hallway. Students from other classes who'd seen the viral videos being posted in real time. Some were holding signs hastily made with notebook paper. "Teach math, not politics, and merit over bias." The situation was about to spiral out of control. But once again, Barron stepped up. Walking to the door, he addressed the growing crowd. "If you're here because you want to learn," he said, his voice carrying a natural authority, "then come in. There's plenty of room." Students flooded in, filling every available space. Dr. Markham watched in amazement as Barron turned back to the board, marker in hand. "Now," he said, "who wants to learn about practical applications of calculus in real-world problem solving?" What happened in that classroom over the next hour would become university legend. But the real story wasn't about equations or politics. It was about something far more powerful that was about to unfold. The story of what happened in Dr. Markham's calculus class spread like wildfire across campus, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of becoming a tale of conflict and humiliation, it transformed into something far more powerful. In the weeks that followed, attendance in the advanced calculus class tripled. Students weren't just coming to learn math. They were coming to witness a remarkable partnership. Dr. Markham, humbled by her experience, returned to her true passion for mathematics. And Barron, true to his word, began hosting study sessions that bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. But the most surprising change wasn't in the curriculum. It was in the culture. The class became known as a place where questions were welcomed, where merit truly mattered, and where learning transcended political divisions. Students who had once felt intimidated by both the subject and the atmosphere now found themselves excelling. One day, as Barron was helping a struggling student master a difficult concept, Dr. Markham approached him. "You know," she said, "you could have destroyed my career that day. Instead, you helped save it." She paused, then added, "Your father would be proud." Barron's response reflected the wisdom beyond his years. "The goal was never to tear anyone down, Professor. It was to lift everyone up." Today, that calculus class serves as a reminder that true education isn't about power struggles or political agendas. It's about the pursuit of knowledge, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to do so with grace. And Barron Trump, he still sits in the back of the class, still helps struggling students, and still believes that the greatest privilege of all is the opportunity to learn and to help others do the same. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you thought about this episode. See you in the next video.